Thank you so much, Ana Maria. Thank you also, Chris, for the IPA team, Mika, for the invitation to present this project. Thank you in advance, Cristian, for your comments to this project. Right, so this project is titled Non-Cognitive or Socioemotional Skills Development and School-Based Violence Reduction in Central America. This is a joint project with Pablo Gaña from Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez in Chile and Claudia Martinez from the PUC Chile. This project, like in a nutshell, what we are trying to do is to provide experimental evidence on the protection and social-emotional learning components of an after-school program implemented in 3 countries, in Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, in public schools in these 3 countries. And we look at the effects of these 2 components on the academic performance and also behavior at school. Moreover, another novelty of this project is that we are able to collect additional, like, non-self-reported measures of some non-cognitive skills, and also we are able to collect information on emotional regulation using a novel application based on artificial intelligence. Right, so that's like the project overall. It was, as I told you, implemented in public schools, and our target population were children between 11 to 16 years of age. Right, so what's the motivation of this paper? We do know that countries in the Northern Triangle of Central America, that is El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, are among the worst 10 deadlest places for adolescents. In particular, for adolescent boys, they are at a very high risk in these 3 countries. Just to give you some figures, for instance, in Honduras, they are almost 2 times more likely to die from homicide than from any other cause. And also in El Salvador and Guatemala, 1/3 of the deaths of these adolescent boys are due to homicide. Like, reports of crime and violence in these countries also show that they have experienced approximately, or on average, a 13% reduction in educational enrollment rate. And over 18% of them, or students, enrolled in public schools in the country have dropped school out due to delinquency. As we know, this actually can be a lower bound of the potential risk that they are exposed, because reporting that they are abandoning school due to delinquency can actually be like, is usually underreported in these countries. So at the end, what we are seeing is that not only the adolescents are exposed to a more general risk, but they are also, that risk of violence are affecting their participation, which is particular enrollment in school. In the country, or we know from the evidence that having a safe environment to learn can be like a condition for productive learning. However, and unfortunately, adolescents in these schools are affected by crime and violence within schools. Schools are actually pretty risky. In the news, for instance, of the 3 main newspapers in the 3 countries, and these are for 2021, we were like, the issue is too salient that they are like very, very important in the news. For instance, you can read the newspaper that students are abandoning schools due to gangs. They're also facing violence and bullying within schools, etc. And some specific statistics, we do know that the school facilities in the 3 countries are located in areas with a high number of gangs, and also gang violence is one of the main cases of school dropout. For instance, a recent report, particularly for El Salvador, shows that 24% of schools are experiencing some issues related to gang members within schools. Also, community gangs are affecting schools in general. 2/3 of schools in the country are facing some issues with local gangs. Moreover, there are some drug-related problems in the community that are affecting every 6 out of 10 schools in the country. And finally, even within the schools, drugs or drugs-related issues are affecting approximately 14% of schools, which are reported by principals. So at the end, like, there is a high risk in terms of crime and violence overall. There are, or students are also affected even within school facilities or in the communities surrounding the schools. And that high exposure to violence can actually negatively affect individuals' well-being. There is evidence showing that exposure to high stress or violence level can have a very important effect on the well-being of individuals, particularly on economic opportunity and especially during adolescence. Why? Because that's the age stage when they are that's the last stage where you can especially modify their, for instance, socio-emotional skills, and therefore that can affect their economic opportunity or even their economic transitions or educational transitions. Moreover, there is a very well-known evidence in the economic literature that high stress and emotional instability can have some unintended effects. For instance, it can affect risk-averse decisions making. Therefore, as individuals are taking some decisions that can generate very low yield or very low returns relative to other decisions that they may have taken if they were not exposed to these highly risky or stressful environments. As a result, that can have some effects on this remaining stuck in the psychological poverty traps. And that's from the economic literature, but then we can complement that evidence with evidence from psychology that shows that once you are exposed to high levels of violence, you or the individual is in a greater likelihood to respond violently to a stimuli, which is what we call the snowball effect of violence. And on average, adolescents are, or when you are exposed to violence during childhood or adolescence, there is evidence that the individual is more likely to commit higher order crimes in the future. In that sense, we know that crime and violence is very important in the region. Adolescents are very exposed. It can cause very important costs in terms of educational outcomes and also socioeconomic outcomes. So what we can do. One alternative is to promote non-cognitive skills to address these risk factors to youth violence. In the existing literature, the relevance of non-cognitive or socio-emotional skills in explaining success over the life cycle is actually very, very well established. The literature has shown that socio-emotional skills are associated with economic success, and most importantly, is not positively affecting individuals in their present or their own economic success, but it can also have some effect of spillover effects in the transmission of economic status across generations. So it's actually very, very powerful because not affecting just the individual, but it can also affect their generations or their families in the future. How socio-emotional skills can cause some economic success because they can improve academic success and also educational transitions, not only completing a particular educational level, but also completing other levels in the future. Thinking on the Cunha and Heckman production function of cognitive outcomes, socio-emotional skills are a very important input for that. Moreover, socio-emotional skills can determine the participation in risky behaviors, and particularly in our case, it can also affect how individuals respond to violence or whether they develop some or act violently or have some violent behaviors. The question here is then, how can we promote socio-emotional skills? There are several interventions that can help us to address that need. However, what we are analyzing here are after-school programs. Why? Because these are examples of intervention that can provide two very important services for the purpose of our need, which is address the risk factors to violence. The first one is protection. The ASPs can keep children under formal supervision to prevent victimization and also delinquent behavior. And in addition to that, while you are protecting children and adolescents, you can also add an additional curriculum that promotes some socio-emotional skills and also control of impulsive behaviors. And that can produce, in addition, a learning, socio-emotional learning component or service here. There are several papers analyzing after-school programs. Most of the existing evidence is for developed countries, particularly for the US. However, some other papers have been evaluating these interventions in different settings. For instance, we have a paper with Pablo Egaña, also evaluating an after-school program in El Salvador, in which we find that this intervention can have some very important effect on misbehavior at school and also on academic performance. Similarly, Claudia Martinez and Marcela Bertigera have a paper on the extension of the full school time in Chile, and they are also finding very, very important effect, particularly for children that were not protected at home. So despite there is a lot of evidence on after-school program, the channel through which these interventions are causing some impact on the different outcomes is still unclear. We don't know yet, but the impact we are seeing is because adolescents are protected, or is it because they are learning something particular from during that time that they are protected? Why are we interested in disentangling these channels? For at least two reasons. The first one is because it's due to resources allocation. If these programs at the end are just protecting adolescents, then the resources should be allocated to keep them just like busy under formal supervision. And we won't need to invest in traditional like curriculum. However, if we do learn that the learning component is important, then we should identify or invest our resources into investing in the most effective curriculum. And also we should like extend the services of this after-school program for at-risk students. And that's what we do in this paper. First of all, we provide experimental evidence on what's the most relevant component of an after-school program in this particular setting. And by component, as I told you, I'm talking about either just being protected or learning something in addition during that time. And that like explicit social-emotional learning component is based on a psychology-based curricula, or we are testing here too, but that's what we are meaning by this social-emotional learning component. We look at the effect on participant behavior and also academic outcomes, some social-emotional skills, and also emotion regulation. The second question we ask in this paper is, what's the most effective curriculum? Since we learned from question one, which I am anticipating the results, that the social-emotional learning component is very relevant or is more important, then we test for two different curricula. Each of them has some very important characteristic. One of them is more intensive, which is the character strength development, the virtue. And the other one, the mindfulness, is a less intensive one. So we test these two with the objective to learn whether having something more intensive is more important than a more light touch intervention. And the third one is who is benefiting from the ASP's components. We want to know whether, for instance, students with some characteristics that make them more vulnerable before the intervention are benefiting more from or less from the intervention relative to other peers that were also treated. And we look at two characteristics: bad behavior at school, and also before the intervention and maternal protection. Just to give you like some a summary of our results, we find that this explicit social emotional learning component is more relevant. It improves not only behavior at school, but it can also reduce a measure of alertness or stress relative to just being protected at school. When we compare the two curricula I mentioned, we find that relative to only protected children, students or the virtue curriculum is positively or improving more outcomes than the mindfulness curriculum. We cannot reject that the effects of the two curricula are different. Therefore, we are not saying that one of them is more effective. We are just saying, or is the most effective. We're just saying that the virtue seems to be more very effective because it's changing or positively or improving more outcomes. And third, the most vulnerable students seems to be benefiting from being protected. The protection component has greater effects for students with worse behavior at baseline, and also those that were not protected while they're or after school time with the maternal presence. That's how we are proxying that component. Right, so that was a summary of the whole project. Now, let me give you some, like very briefly, some details about the intervention, the data we were able to collect, the main results, and at the end, I'll conclude. Right, so as I told you, we are evaluating here after school clubs. For this particular intervention, it took place in 2019, and our partner NGO offered clubs to 21 public schools located in the most violent neighborhoods in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. The participants attended 2 sessions per week. Each of them lasted 1.5 hours, and it took place after school time for 7 months during April to October. The program targets adolescents or students between 11 to 16 years of age. And that age range is very important because, particularly in Central America, because that's when they are more prone to be either recruited to be part of a gang or they decide to self-enroll. We are not saying that with this intervention we are going to avoid that they are going to be recruited. However, what we are saying that with this type of intervention, we can label students as having different skills that are not necessarily the skills that these criminal organizations may need for their operations. That's the only thing that we can claim here with these type of interventions. And finally, these clubs are implemented by volunteers, and they have no formal training on social work or psychology. That's important when we are, for instance, thinking on scalability of these interventions. Right, so for the design of this study in particular, each of the sessions could include 2 parts. The first part could be extracurricular activities, and the other one is this socio-emotional learning, the social skills development, which include activities from a psychology-inspired curriculum. In the extracurricular activities, the children are mainly protected in schools doing activities such as sports, art, and others. There is an instructor in each of these groups, but he or she is responsible to just supervise them with a very specific role. By a specific role, what we mean is that this person was in charge of, for instance, distributing the materials for the club, leading the activities, for instance, giving the soccer ball, helping them to or avoid any conflict between the students, etc. But this instructor did not implement any activity related to the psychology-inspired curriculum. It's important to note here that there may be some learning from the interaction between the children while they are in the after school. However, our claim for the explicit socio-emotional learning component is for the activities related to the psychology-inspired curriculum. Right, so some schools just receive these extracurricular activities. However, others receive on top of that, but keeping the same length or duration of the sessions, some activities related to this character strength or virtue curriculum. The curriculum was developed by local experts and psychologists, and it was inspired by the Peterson 2004 model of character strengths. It includes in total 32 sessions of training and reflection, and the strengths this curriculum aims to develop are mainly perseverance, self-regulation, among others. Other schools were on top of the extracurricular activities, and again, keeping the duration of the sessions, they included additional activities related to mindfulness. The program is called Salón Tranquilo, and it's a mindfulness-based and relaxation response program. It was adapted from the Luster Learning Institute program by the NGO, and it was piloted in 2017 with a small group of students. It aims to develop self-awareness, mental concentration, and inner calm, and also to manage stress. It includes a total of 16 different activities of breathing, stretching, relaxation, and focusing techniques. The difference between the 2 interventions is how intensive they are. In this one, the virtual intervention, they have more material, they need more materials. The training is more, for the instructors, is a bit more intensive, whereas here, the activities are actually, you don't need materials, as you can see here, you just need a share, for instance, to practice these activities. And, right. So what's the experimental design? How we were able to, or are able to test whether protection or learning components of this ASP are more important. We work with 29 schools in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, and we created an experimental variation with 21 schools. we randomly allocated 7 of them to the extracurricular activities, other 7 to this virtual curriculum, and other 7 to mindfulness. By comparing these 7 schools in the extracurricular activities with these other 14 schools from any of the psychology-based intervention, we can measure like the explicit socio-emotional learning component. Since we also wanted to know what was the net protection component, we created a non-experimental variation using propensity score matching. We selected 8 schools, and then by comparing these 8 schools that are going to be our pure control, which means that they are going to receive no after school at all. Students are going to go back to their home after school time. Then by comparing this 8 school with this 7 school, we'll be able to measure or to provide some suggestive evidence of the protection component of the ASP. This is the timeline. We started in January 2019 with the identification of schools, agreements with principals, the submission to the local ethics committee. Then we recruited participants in February 2019. We collected baseline information in March 2019. And the first short-term follow-up was collected in November, right after we ended the implementation of the program. And we wanted to collect a midterm follow-up in July, August 2020, but it was canceled due to the pandemic. However, we collected some midterm follow-up information in February 2029, which was mostly enrollment in 2020 academic year. Moreover, we also conducted focus groups with the teachers and parents in the 29 schools, just to validate our quantitative findings with the perceptions of changes of the main outcomes from parents and also teachers. The data we collected is something pretty novel from our project. We collected 2 main categories of outcomes. We collected information, main outcomes, which are behavior at school and academic performance. And also for the mechanisms, we collected data on social-emotional skills and emotional regulation and arousal. These two, the mechanisms were collected using applications. For the social-emotional skills, we used an app called Soft Games, developed by Dano and co-authors, and is a task-based games application. And also for emotion regulation and arousal or alertness, we used an artificial intelligence application called Reactiva. As I told you, the main outcomes are behavior at school, where we collected teacher reports of student behavior at school following this scale. These reports were actually produced in most of the schools before the intervention, so it's like part of their day-to-day business. They produce these measures. And similarly for academic performance, we collected only a math score, and this is produced in a scale from 0 to 10, where 10 is the highest score. And we're using math scores because that's like the curriculum that's more similar across the 3 countries. And we also collected, as I told you, school enrollment in 2020. For the mechanisms, we are creating a socio-emotional skills index that's constituted by 3 measures: perseverance, defined as a continued effort to do or achieve something, and here we're using the additions game. Here actually what we are measuring is short-term persistence. Then in terms of impulsiveness, which is defined as a tendency of an individual to act suddenly without thinking carefully, we are using the go, no-go task. Here we expose the student to 2 stimuli, the go stimuli, no-go stimuli, which are like tapping the screen of a tablet when for the go task, which is when a square appears and it's any color different than black. The no-go task for the black square. So the outcomes measure has the number of times that the individual or the student in this case responded correctly to the no-go task. And then for risk-taking behavior, we are measuring here is defined as any control behavior with a perceived uncertainty about the outcome. And here we are using the balloon analog risk task, which is the outcomes measure has the total point that you can obtain from the balloons that did not pop because you are like pumping them. I can give you more, happy to give you more details either at the end of Christian's comments or offline. You can email me to give you more details about how we are like any of these games and also how we were able to use that application and how what we learned to bring it into the field. And finally, to measure emotional regulation, which is defined as a process that amplify, attenuate, or maintain an emotion. Whether you, like in short, is whether you can control your emotions, how you respond emotionally or physically to a particular stimulus. And there are also is defined as a state of high attention or alertness that can affect your decision-making process. We collected these two outcomes using this artificial intelligence-based application. As you can see here in the figure, how we bring it to the field was like we showed, we gave students this tablet and we showed them some videos. So we were using the front camera of the tablet, we were able to see or to measure their facial gestures. And for instance, like how they move their lips, their eyebrows, etc. And using a massive data set of emotions, we are able to predict using these facial gestures, what are the emotions that the children are showing. And using an algorithm developed by my colleague Pablo Gaña, we're able to translate those emotions into measures of valence or emotion regulation, and a roles are or this measure of alertness. What are our main results? As I told you, like I am going very fast, but I think this is actually a very important novelty of this paper, and I'm very happy. I will be very glad to share more details about this and how you can bring also these tools to the field if you are interested. Right, so what are our main results? First of all, we learned that the explicit socio-emotional learning component is more relevant to improve behavior at school relative to just protecting students. For those students that receive either virtue or mindfulness activity on top of the extracurricular activities, their behavior at school is improved in approximately 0.45 standard deviations relative to students that were just protected, meaning that adding these additional activities can have very important effect on behavior at school. We find nothing on academic performance, which is unlike our previous paper using only data from El Salvador. The pure protection component can have also some, we don't find any, can have very limited effects on behaviors and also academic performance for the average student. And it's also different from what we found in this other paper with Pablo Gaña in El Salvador, in which we did find some positive effects on behavior school and math grades. Differences can be explained by some implementation like difficulties that we can discuss later in this particular project related to the other one. Right, so like summarizing these two results, adding additional activities from a psychology-based curriculum can have very important effects, particularly in terms of behavior at school. Then, since we learned that the socio-emotional component is important, then and it affected behavior, what can be explaining that? What socio-emotional skills or emotion regulation measures were changed? We find that those treated in the socio-emotional learning component relative to those that were just protected reduced their like alertness, which in this particular context can be very important because that's how they can learn to control their automatic, for instance, automatic responses to different stimulus. We find very marginal effects in terms of socio-emotional skills index. What we are finding, like the magnitudes are like relatively important, is around 0.15 standard deviations. However, it's not statistically significant at the 10%. We are just mentioning that because the magnitude can be very interesting. Moreover, for those that were just protected, we are finding that there is an increase in these measures of alertness for the average student. This is very important. And what we can learn in terms of policy from here is that we can have these, like adding these additional activities from the psychology-based curriculum can have very important effects. Then, what's the most efficient curriculum? As I told you at the very beginning, we cannot rule out that the effects between the two virtue and mindfulness were different between each other. However, what we found is that the virtue curriculum can have more, or can have effects on more outcomes relative to the mindfulness-based programs. The virtue is having effects on behavior at school, perseverance, and arousal, and mindfulness are having effects only on decreasing arousal when we compare with children that were just protected. And therefore, we conclude that the virtue curriculum can actually be very effective, which is, again, a more intensive intervention that it was developed actually following a consultation process in which the NGO invited students from the 3 countries to help them to develop to gauge their needs in terms of skills, and therefore use that information to develop the program. And finally, in the differences in the ASP by students' characteristics, we find that students with worse behavior at baseline are having greater effect when they are protected. And it's improving their behaviors and also other skills. In that sense, and it can be explained because after we discussed this result with the NGO, what we found is that implementing these the activities of the psychology-based curriculum was a bit complicated for these children because they had this predisposition to act. So changing that was a bit more complicated. And then there are some positive complementarity between maternal and ASP protection component. Children that were not protected at home, which we measure the mother was not present after school time, they are more likely to benefit from the protection of the ASP. Right, so to conclude, I think just 1 minute. The paper is measuring some differences in the protection and learning channel of this ASP that was implemented in a context that's very relevant, the most violent country for adolescents in Latin America. And we're looking at the effects on behavior, academic performance, social-emotional skills, and emotional regulation. Our results find that the explicit learning component is more relevant. And among the 2 psychological curriculum tested, the more intensive and specifically designed curriculum can be effective. We also find this important heterogeneity, which is that those with worse behavior at baseline, the protection mechanism can be very relevant. In that sense, something that we learn is that designing psychology-based activities based on these youth needs constitutes a policy that's very, very important. And the policy implications of this work are that these results can help to design and also targeting this intervention. They still open a question on what type of curriculum, what activities are useful for the more vulnerable students that can be added on top of just being protected to have these additional gains that we found for the average student. The adaptation and involvement of beneficiaries in the design is something that we also learned that can have very important effect, again, for the average student. So maybe we should think on what kind of student we should involve in that, in the collection of needs. Finally, exploring the role of the instructor is still a gap in the existing literature, and we still need to learn what volunteers' characteristics are more relevant. And therefore, we can target our interventions in a more effective way. And finally, something that's still a gap from these programs is what are the effects of these interventions in the long term, and also measuring the ASP's impact on other well-being measures. Data availability is limiting this analysis, particularly because at least in Central America, in these 3 countries, only Honduras has a unique ID, and you can follow students in administrative data sets. However, for the other 2 countries, that's not possible. So that's still something that we do need to learn, whether these gains are continue even in the long term. So that's all from my end. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Lelys, for this insightful paper. I mean, highly relevant topic, working and measuring social prevention interventions in highly violent contexts. I mean, it's so relevant to the work we do in Latin America, that we do here in the Chilean Undersecretary of Crime Prevention. So I think it's very, very, very interesting research. It will be a good idea to provide you again a brief summary of what was the paper about. So it's analyzing these social, emotional learning and protection components on an after-school program in 3 Central American countries. The research design experimentally disentangles the social emotional learning and the protection components. I think this is a key aspect of the paper. This is one of the main contributions of it. So it's very important that we all have it in mind. It's assessing different outcomes, the impact on student behavior, math grades, school enrollment, and several non-cognitive or social-emotional skills. And also, this is also very, very relevant, and it connects very much with the issue or with the challenge of targeting, is that the paper takes very seriously the issue of heterogeneity, right? That the program might affect different students in different ways, right? So what we learn, what are the key findings of the paper from the learning component part? It's very convincing that this part of the intervention improved behavior at school, so this is good news. But on math grades and enrollment, we show positive results, but these are not statistically significant. The paper shows that there's a reduction in the proxy for stress or this variable of arousal, right? This is other good news from the paper. But on the other hand, there's several other non-cognitive skills that are measured where the results are not statistically significant, right? There's a great work there measuring all these skills. There's another very large contribution for the paper. And what's also very important, and Lelys emphasized this a lot, is that well-behaved students are driving the effects on improvements in behavior and arousal reduction, right? So it's not a constant effect across all students. It's basically well-behaved students, the ones where we are observing the most large and positive results, right, and significant results, right? So this implies that there are several key takeaways from these findings. The learning component matters. It's very good news. And adding this psychological-based curriculum is necessary to generate positive impacts in an after-school program, right? And we should all have this in mind, right? So it's not going to be any type of after-school intervention. It has to be some with a psychological-based component, the ones that's going to drive some results. But these results will be shown on mostly well-behaved students, right? And these have key policy implications, I believe, right? And I will discuss them in a few slides. On the other hand, moving to the protection component of the after-school program, there's no effect on behavior at school, math grades, and school enrollment for the average student, but there is some unintended or negative effect on an increase in this proxy for stress. In terms of the other non-cognitive skills, the results are not statistically significant, but, and this is very important, we have very clear, Lelys emphasized this a lot again, there are heterogeneous results, there are positive and statistically significant results on behavior at school for badly behaved students, and also there are statistically significant difference on behavior at school between students that are protected compared to those who are not protected at home, right? So the most important takeaway from policy implications for me from this part of the research is that the protection component seems to be more useful, and this likelihood seems to be, we are not entirely sure, but seems to be more useful for those with the highest risks, right? What do we imply with this? Those who are not protected at home and or who are badly behaved students, right? And I think this is also very important to have in mind. One of the topics or questions that they asked me to provide comments on is what these results imply about tackling young people's participation in crime, right? We are in a crime and violence seminar. And I think it's very important to have to reflect on the paper and realize that the paper does not directly address the question, the very important question of youth involvement in crime, right? However, the paper do analyze relevant crime-related risk factors at the individual level, right? And we know that risk factors at the individual level are very important in the group of risk factors like that are determinant of crime participation, right? So we don't answer a crime-related question directly, but we are like putting some light on very related risk factors that are related with crime, right? So we learned that the learning component impacted school behavior and arousal, but showed no results and outcomes, and that there is a heterogeneity, that the results are driven by well-behaved students. So then my reflection is, and relating this with crime, right? Is this enough to prevent youth participation in crime, especially thinking well-behaved youth, right? Because this is the one where we are showing stronger results or statistically significant results in the learning piece of the program, right? Which brought me to the original question: are these students likely to be involved in crime without the program? If these are the well-behaved students among their peers, right? It might not be enough for the context, highly violent context where these are located, right? But these are already the well-behaved students. The program is, the learning components only showing results on this group. Are this group going to be involved in crime without the program, right? So when we think about like mechanism and possible potential effects of this program in crime, I'm sure you'll have plenty of other good news in outcomes that are very important for development, but in crime, I'm thinking the jury's still out, right? I don't know if the learning component will affect crime involvement for this group that is where they're showing some result, right? On the other hand, the protection component is likely relevant for those students with the highest risk, right? Those who are badly behaved students are not protected at home, right? And I would think that this group is much more likelihood to be involved in crime activities, right? So if there's an effect of the protection component there, it might be likelier that the protection component part will have probably the strongest effect on crime prevention of youth, right? From what we have learned from the results, right? So like for the jump from what we are learning from the paper to crime, it needs, I think, another reflection on what's going on and how heterogeneity might matter a lot, right? So in terms of challenges that we could face when implementing these type of policies, I think we need to think very carefully about the context here, right? So how these programs are provided might influence a lot what we can expect from these programs, right? Are these going to be provided from private or public institution? In this case, there's an NGO providing this. If it's going to be public oriented or implemented, it's going to be centrally managed or through local governments, because all these have very different implications and challenges, right? Being able to hire and employ qualified human resources for the program, I think it will be a key aspect, right? It will be very different to have like political appointees type of operators in working out these programs, right, and not having them, or being able to expand rapidly might be much more difficult for a small NGO rather than from a large government, right? So there are some trade-offs there that we need to think carefully, and also I think this program or intervention, it's in the frontier within education, development, and crime prevention security, right? And who will implement this in practice? It will be like more social type of intervention or a crime prevention security type of intervention. I think will matter a lot. It will matter what are the outcomes, what will be the target population, what to expect, the accountability and evaluation that will be from the public perspective, what will be expected from these programs. I will find a lot their frontier of policy relevant questions, right? And I think we need to think carefully about these implications, right? In terms of context, specific aspects, and I'm coming back to this targeting type of issues. If adding a psychological-based curriculum is necessary to generate positive impact, we already all agree with that. My second question will be, well, can we be better off without the after-school program after all, right? Why we don't get rid of that? I mean, if that's the part that's not working for some type of students, right? But it's not that easy, right? If we can get rid of this part, will depend very much on the institutional capacity to target students effectively without using schools. Schools are very useful to allocate students or to reach students. It might be not easy to reach them without schools, and or the ability to modify the school curriculum by adding a psychological partner. And I think all these questions are very highly context specific, right? Even within a country can be very context specific, right? Especially also between countries, right? And also if we learn from this research that these learning or protection components are effective for some subgroup of students, which are different for both components, my follow-up question will be, can we provide it only to these groups, right? To these subgroups. But again, it is not that easy because it implies heavily like relying on individual level targeting, which is not something that's straightforward to do. So the ability to identify student profile before implementation and organize the intervention by these different profiles might be as well very context specific, right? But I think there are challenges that we need to think very carefully when implementing policies like this, right? What are some, to sum up my comments, what are open questions that are still there to be answered? I think I would like to learn more about what does imply improved behavior at school, right? Because the research showed that this is some variable that's very important when there is some impact. And I think I would like from the paper to learn a little bit more about this outcome. At least it could be from more like a qualitative perspective, right? Especially as it turns out to be an important variable. And as well, of course, the paper cannot answer all the possible questions. It does a great job answering like some specific questions. But then it will be another paper. I think, of course, the question will be, well, what's the impact on criminal behavior and engagement in violence? And then I asked Lelys, is there a follow-up paper that is tackling this question? I think that's probably the obvious question there. It's also very important from the policy toolkit design that we need to remind that there's a very important target population that's not in this paper, which are those that already dropped out from school. And we know that those who are dropped out are very likely to be involved in crime. So the paper is not addressing this question. It's important to have that in clarity because we might also want to learn about this specific population. And again, the question of sustainability, effects persist after 12 over 24 months. I think it's also another important question. They did have a follow-up in the research design. COVID-19, the pandemic say otherwise, but I think that will also a nice question to know a little bit more, right? So again, thank you for having me here. It has been a pleasure to comment this paper and great work from Lelys. Congratulations to her and all the team.